Have you ever had something terrible happen at your child's daycare? Well, let me tell you about my 6-month-old daughter Emma. For some reason, she started sleeping a lot more than usual. One day, when I went to pick her up from daycare, she was lying in her car seat and didn't even move to get her diaper changed. I was about to call the doctor when something caught my eye, a dry, pink substance around the nipple of her bottle. I tasted it and immediately recognized it. It was the same medicine I use for my allergies, the kind that always makes me drowsy. Someone had been giving my baby something that knocked her out. I went straight back inside and demanded to speak with the director. He looked at me, clearly taken aback, and said this was a serious accusation. He asked if I had any proof of who had done this. There were only 2 teachers in the room, Miss Thompson, who had worked there for 10 years, and Miss Davis, who was always concerned about the kids. I told him the evidence was in the bottle and that my daughter could barely stay awake. He looked at me as if I was crazy and suggested that maybe the rest of the formula in the bottle was just milk. I asked to see the footage from the classroom cameras, but he said those were for security purposes only and I couldn't view them without a court order. So, I took Emma to the emergency room, and the doctors confirmed my worst fear. The level of James Adderall in her system was dangerously high for a baby. The doctor explained that if she had been taking it over a period of time, it could affect her breathing. When I told him it had been happening for weeks, he said he'd treated 2 other children with similar symptoms at the same daycare the previous month. But I couldn't put the pieces together until now. Looking back, Emma had been sleeping a lot for at least 3 weeks, but I told myself it was just because she was growing fast and teething. The whole situation was tearing me apart. I called the police from the hospital to report what I'd learned. Unfortunately, they said they couldn't make any arrests without knowing who was responsible. One officer even suggested I might have accidentally given her too much medicine myself. I was stunned. I went back to the daycare, barely holding it together, and showed them the hospital report, which confirmed that Emma had been drugged. Miss Thompson just looked at her, unfazed, and said, "The child sleeps a lot." Meanwhile, Miss Davis seemed shaken and couldn't meet my eyes. The director read the report and told me that they would conduct an internal investigation, but they couldn't take action against the staff based on a child's test results alone. I asked if they could test every child there, just like they did with Emma, but they said that would be illegal and might result in them being sued for wrongful termination. They told me that if I wasn't happy with their response, I was free to find another daycare. I called around to every daycare within a 40-minute radius of my job, but they all had waiting lists longer than 8 months. Hiring a nanny was too expensive, and my mom lived too far away to help. If I missed another day of work, I'd lose my job. The next morning, I had no choice but to drop Emma off again. Afterward, I found myself throwing up in the parking lot. I started calling the other parents in Emma's room, and that's when I learned that 3 other children had been sleeping unusually long hours too. One mother told me her son had become so lethargic that she took him to the doctor, thinking he might have a developmental issue. Another father shared that he complained to Ms. Thompson about his son's lack of energy, and she had just smiled and told him to be grateful for the break. It turned out, Miss Thompson and her colleague had been giving drugs to several kids, and the director was protecting them. I found out from a former employee that parents had been complaining about kids sleeping excessively in Miss Thompson's room for years, but nothing was ever done because she was close friends with the director's sister. When I threatened to take the story to the media, the director threw my contract in my face and showed me the non-disclosure agreement I had signed. He pointed to the clause that said if I damaged their reputation, I'd be financially responsible for any loss. I could tell that Miss Thompson was uncomfortable when I picked up Emma later that day. She forced a smile and told me it had been a bad day. I wanted to scream at her, expose her for the 25 years of abuse she'd hidden, but instead, I just looked her in the eye and quietly said, "I know what you've been doing." She responded in a slow, almost mocking tone, "Prove it." And when Emma was lying unconscious in my arms, Miss Thompson gave me a sly wink. The next morning, I felt like I was handing my daughter over to a monster. But I had a plan. I hid a camera in her diaper bag. I sat in the parking lot, watching the live feed on my phone. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the phone steady. At 10:15, I saw Miss Thompson take a bottle of children's James Adderall from her bag and pour it into 4 different bottles, including Emma's. She mixed them all and placed them in the fridge. In less than 2 minutes, she'd drugged 4 kids, as if it was just part of her routine. I had video proof of her committing the crime. I knew exactly what needed to be done to put an end to all of this. Holding my phone tightly in both hands, I stopped trembling and hit the upload button for my cloud storage. I began backing up the video. But the progress bar moved so slowly that I felt like screaming. I plugged my USB drive into my car charger and copied the file there. The percentage was slowly climbing. My mind raced, thinking that if something happened to my phone, I needed multiple copies of this video. I immediately sent it to my personal email, making sure the timestamp was included. All the while, I kept glancing at the door, feeling an overwhelming urge to run in and grab every child out of that room. Instead, I focused on sending the video to my email. The director stood in front of Miss Thompson, arms crossed, almost as if her mind was somewhere else. She began by saying she was stuck in a prison, and that she didn't know anything about Miss Thompson's wrongdoings. A father sitting in the front row stood up, suggesting that, during such a tough time, we should all support the daycare. "Where else will we find childcare?" he said. Some of the parents, already agreeing with him, nodded and shook their heads. The director kept insisting that she had always run a professional facility and that one bad employee shouldn't affect the whole center. I stood up and reminded everyone that many children had been drugged for months, and no one did anything about it. What followed was chaos. Half the parents were shouting that the daycare should be shut down immediately, while the other half argued that if it closed, they'd lose their jobs. A mother behind me screamed that I was being selfish, trying to ruin everyone's lives over a single incident. Another parent yelled back, saying this wasn't just one incident, but a pattern of children being drugged. The room was filled with people yelling at each other, pointing fingers, while the director just stood there, watching it all unfold. Someone threw a bottle of water, and the parents started pushing one another. I grabbed my purse and left before things escalated any further, calling the police on my way out. The next morning, as I was feeding Emma, someone knocked on my door. Two people in suits, showing CPS badges, told me they had received a complaint that I was giving the wrong medicine to my child. My stomach dropped because I knew what was happening. The daycare staff was trying to accuse me. I let them in and showed them the hospital report, the video of Miss Thompson pouring medicine into bottles, and all the documents I had collected. The woman carefully examined everything, while the man watched Emma play on her bed. He told me that he understood what was happening but, by protocol, the case had to remain open for 90 days. He handed me his card and reassured me not to worry about Emma's safety with me, but if anything else happened, to call him. As soon as they left, I rushed to the bathroom to throw up from the tension. 2 days later, I received an email saying that the state licensing department had ordered the daycare to suspend operations temporarily. Parents were scrambling to find new childcare, and my phone was flooded with angry messages. One mother told me I had ruined her life because she had to quit her job. Another left a voicemail demanding that I pay for everyone's lost wages. I blocked most of the numbers, but it didn't stop the stress from building. Even though I knew I was in the right, the guilt weighed heavily on me. That afternoon, John called. He told me he'd been digging into Ms. Thompson's background and had found something. 5 years ago, she had been involved in another daycare where parents had complained about improper sleep arrangements. When she came to our daycare, the director's sister got her a job, and the complaint mysteriously disappeared. John said it was almost identical to what she had done at our center. I asked why no action had been taken, and he explained that the second daycare had been shut down eventually, and the case was dropped. The following week, my boss called me into his office. He placed a paper on my desk. It was a performance improvement plan, giving me 90 days to fix my attendance and missed deadlines, or I would be fired. He mentioned that he thought I was struggling with personal issues, but the company needed my trust. I wanted to explain everything, but I knew it would sound like an excuse. I signed the paper, my hand shaking from the stress. That afternoon, the officer from CPS called again, saying that if the case went to trial, I would have to testify. She told me that Miss Thompson's lawyer was working hard to reach a deal to avoid jail time. The officer said my testimony and video evidence were crucial, but warned me that the defense would try to discredit me, calling me an unmarried mother. I told her I would testify no matter what they threw my way. The next day, Grace called me, crying. She had found out that Ms. Davis had cut a deal with the defense attorney. Apparently, Davis knew about the drugs all along but was too afraid of losing her job to report it. She had agreed to testify against Miss Thompson in exchange for a reduced sentence. Grace was devastated, feeling that Davis should have been held accountable for her role in all of this. I shared her anger, but at least Davis was cooperating now. 3 days later, Ravi called again. He said that after seeing the news coverage, 3 more families had come forward. One child had suffered a stroke the previous month, and the parents now suspected it was due to the Jamsadrol. Another family had kept a record of their child's unusual sleepiness over several weeks. The third family had saved their child's bottles, and they had tested positive for the same substance. He told me that the case had become much stronger and that Ms. Thompson might now be willing to accept the charges against her. 2 days later, I received a thick envelope from the insurance company. Inside, it said they were reviewing whether they should cover the director's legal defense costs. The letter mentioned that if they found evidence of criminal negligence or intentional harm, they wouldn't cover her lawyer's fees. I immediately forwarded it to my lawyer, who told me this might pressure the director into making a deal rather than continuing to fight alone. That same afternoon, Miss Davis called me, crying. She said she wanted to help. She came to my apartment with a written statement, stating that the director had clearly instructed the staff to keep the children quiet during the royal examination. She explained that before the examiners arrived, the director would remind them that any crying children might be forced to wash their hands and be sent home. Davis's hands were trembling as she signed the statement in front of my lawyer. She admitted that she was terrified to speak up at first, but after seeing the test results, she realized just how much harm she had been a part of. I started seeing a therapist the following week to work through the overwhelming guilt and anxiety. I could barely afford therapy, with my budget being so tight. But the therapist helped me understand that people like Ms. Larson thrive because they depend on the parents to keep their exploitation going. She told me that what happened wasn't rare, but it was wrong because I had trusted the people responsible for my child's well-being. 3 weeks after the hair follicle tests came back, it was confirmed that all the children had been exposed to Jamsadrol for at least 2 months. John's child had been exposed for 4 months, and when he saw the report, he threw up. The lab technician said that the level of exposure was concerning, and if it had continued, it could have caused developmental delays. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. A local reporter wanted an interview about the daycare scandal, but my lawyer advised against speaking publicly until the criminal case was over. The possibility of a settlement still hung over me like a sword ready to fall. If I said the wrong thing to the media, everything could fall apart. After Miss Davis testified in front of the grand jury, the judge finally arrested Miss Larson for conspiracy and endangering children. Her sister posted a $50,000 bail within 3 hours of the arrest. When Ms. Larson was released and came out of the courthouse wearing sunglasses, I saw her from my car. Ignoring the reporter's questions, she continued to claim her innocence, even 2 months later. Her lawyer argued that my video had been obtained illegally. The judge said they were accepting the case, thanks to my determination to settle the issue of my child's well-being, including the diaper bag. After hearing about the children being drugged for months, it made no sense to protect the daycare. I was shocked to see how deep Ms. Larson's connections were, especially with her family tied to the daycare. It seems that the director used her family ties to suppress complaints and keep everything quiet. When the judge announced his decision, Ms. Larson's face went pale. After the hearing, he called a group of our family members to the side and offered Ms. Larson a deal. She could plead guilty to reduced charges and serve 6 months in jail. She would also lose her teaching license forever. Half of our group felt 6 months wasn't enough for someone who had been drugging children for years, while the other half just wanted to put it behind them and move on. Olivia said she wanted Ms. Larson to be released after the case rather than serving jail time. John, on the other hand, wanted to reject the deal and push for charges of attempted murder. The argument got so heated that 2 fathers nearly came to blows in the court parking lot. Meanwhile, some parents filed a petition to reopen the daycare under new management, arguing that the community needed adequate childcare. Others wanted the building demolished and the land salted so nothing could ever grow there again. The online arguments became so intense that people began choosing sides and attacking innocent parties. Those advocating for the daycare's reopening were accused of supporting child abuse, while those wanting to shut it down were branded as enemies of childcare. Then, someone leaked my name in a Facebook group, and suddenly I was bombarded with messages. Some called me a hero, while others labeled me a terrible mother. After the criminal case settled, my performance at work started to improve a little, but I still felt unsettled with the situation. One day, while I was in the break room, a security guard pulled me aside and warned me that my boss was looking for any excuse to fire me. He told me that I had become too much of a distraction for the company, and they needed someone who could focus fully on their work. With the added strain of therapy and legal bills, I couldn't afford to lose my job. But at the same time, I couldn't give up the fight for justice for Emma and all the other kids. 3 weeks later, David Collins called me with some good news. Dikia's license had been revoked permanently. The building's owner had planned to convert it into a dental office next month, so there was no chance of the daycare reopening under a different name. I sat outside my car, taking a deep breath of relief, while Emma slept in the backseat. Merrickshak told me that Dikia had been abusing children for years, and no one had ever properly reported it. But because of our case, the state was changing the way it handled complaints. That afternoon, Ms. Carol's lawyer called my lawyer and said that she had been listening to the hearing. There were 4 charges of putting children in danger, and the recommendation was for an 18-month sentence in county jail. My lawyer said we should take the risk and go to trial, as the jury could be sympathetic toward a woman who was clearly in need of help. The hearing was set for the following week, and if we wanted, we could provide statements as victims. I spent 3 sleepless nights writing my statement, practicing reading it aloud. The courtroom was filled with reporters who had been following the Dikia case and the story. Miss Carol sat there in a gray suit, looking small and insignificant. I remember her lawyer whispering something to her. When the judge asked what she had to say for herself, she stood up and claimed she had been trying to manage an impossible task. She said she hadn't received enough support for the many children under her care. She went on about how the parents hoped for a miracle and how she did what she had to do to survive. Not one of us or our children heard an apology. The judge sentenced her to 18 months and ordered her to surrender immediately. 2 deputies handcuffed her and escorted her out, but she just stared straight ahead as though we weren't even there. The next day, there was another hearing, and this time, a different judge seemed more sympathetic. Her lawyer painted her as a victim, saying she had trusted her employees and didn't know what was happening in the children's room. The judge presented an email showing complaints from parents about the children's excessive sleep. But the judge said there was no evidence that Miss Carol knew about the drugging. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison and fined $10,000. However, she didn't actually have to go to jail. She was also banned from working in a hospital, but her lawyer said she was already planning to retire. When she left the courthouse, I wanted to scream, knowing that our children were still struggling with what happened. The other parents looked just as sick as I felt watching her walk away with probation. Within an hour of the hearing, I called every daycare center in the area, desperate to find a new place for Emma. But the waiting lists were months long, with some even taking up to a year. Finally, I got lucky. A family had recently moved out of state, and I managed to get Emma a spot at a daycare that was 50 minutes away from my job. It was a relief, but the commute would cost me $300 a month. The director asked for the first month's rent, the last month, and a security deposit, $400 total. I didn't have that kind of money. I went to 3 different banks before one of them approved me for a personal loan, but with a whopping 18% interest rate. Due to the mounting lawyer fees, my credit had already taken a hit. That's why the loan I got was really the best option available to me. At New Dikia, there were cameras in every room, all of which parents could monitor through an app. Twice a year, they also conducted background checks on every employee. The CPS sent their final letter, informing me that they were closing my case. However, they made it clear that the report would always remain in their system. My lawyer warned me that if I ever went through a divorce or had custody issues, even though I was completely innocent, the case might still come up in an investigation. He told me it wasn't fair, but that's just how the system worked, and there wasn't much we could do about it. John and Olivia's family came together to start a group lawsuit, hoping to file against Dikia's insurance company. The insurance lawyers immediately pointed to the illegal clauses in our contracts, where we had agreed to mandatory mediation for any disputes. My lawyer explained that mediation could take up to 18 months, and that mediators usually sided with businesses instead of the people. Each of us would have to pay $500 for mediation, with no guarantee that we'd get anything in return. The Adikanj family couldn't ignore the cost, especially since we'd already spent so much on everything else. Even 6 weeks after learning about the drugs, I was still taking Emma to specialists to check for any developmental delays. The specialist told me that she seemed fine for now, but some effects might not show up for years. Every time Emma stayed home for the day, I'd get anxious. It was because of the James Adderall. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. Heart racing, sure something was wrong with her breathing. I'd stand by her bed, watching her chest rise and fall, until the alarm went off for work. On weekends, John and Olivia's family started coming over, and we'd all sit there, watching our children sleep, unable to take our eyes off them. We couldn't find peace, not even in each other's homes. After everything that had happened, trusting anyone again felt impossible. Olivia's mom said she had quit her job to stay home with her child because she couldn't bear the thought of taking care of someone else's child. John's wife had to start working nights so one of them could always be home. None of us could adjust to these new changes. Even with all the financial strain, we knew we had to make the change. The old daycare building was now a real estate office, and every day I had to drive past it on my way to the new daycare. One Tuesday, I saw the signboard and had to pull over because I was crying so much, I couldn't see the road. I kept remembering the last day I left Emma there, when I captured Miss Thompson on camera, and my stomach would twist. Every time I used to drop Emma off at the park, the real estate company had put up a yellow banner and some flowers. My work performance was deemed acceptable, but my supervisor handed me a pile of papers showing all the days I'd taken off or left early. She said she understood what I was going through, but that the company needed consistency, something I couldn't give anymore. She saw me as a lost cause, and that meant no promotion or bonus this year. She also placed me on a performance improvement plan, which meant if I didn't improve, I'd be fired. I signed the papers with trembling hands, left the office, and realized I was stuck between keeping my job and protecting my child. The next few months passed in a blur of legal paperwork, while life went on like nothing had happened. My lawyer said it takes time, but every week, more and more legal bills piled up on my kitchen table. The legal fees wiped out all my savings, and now I was charging everything to a credit card with 23% interest. After 8 months, the case against Miss Thompson finally moved forward. She was arrested on camera, and her lawyer made a deal, pleading guilty to putting children in danger, though not for the charges she should have faced. She accepted the deal and was sentenced to 18 months, but everyone knew she'd be out in no time for good behavior. Other lawyers started a group chat to share updates, but most of them had moved on. Some had found new jobs, others stayed at home. I couldn't do either, so I ended up sending Emma to a daycare 40 minutes away, which cost me over $300 a month. Even a year after all this started, we were still stuck in limbo, fighting over whether the daycare was responsible for its employees' actions. My lawyer kept asking for more money to continue the fight, and when I couldn't sleep at night, I found myself searching online for lawyers, even on Diwali. The legal bill reached $30,000, and I still owed $15,000 to the hospital for all of Emma's tests and treatments. Miss Thompson got out after just 4 months of imprisonment. I saw her packing food for her friends at a local store in our community. Someone in our group chat posted a picture, and we all warned each other to stay away from that store. I went there to see if it was really her, and sure enough, she was scanning items in a green apron, like she had never harmed any of the kids. During Emma's 18-month checkup, the pediatric specialist noted some developmental delays and ordered a consultation for further evaluation. Miss Thompson might have been sentenced to just 4 months, but for the rest of us, her actions would haunt us forever. After tax season, the financial math was worse than I could ever calculate. The specialist said Emma was delayed in speech and motor skills, but couldn't say for certain if it was caused by the James Adderall or just a general developmental delay. I spent hours searching for answers, wondering if keeping children sedated for so long caused permanent damage. Every study I found seemed to say something different. I felt even worse knowing there was no clear answer. Most of the other parents in the daycare group stopped responding to the chat and moved on with their lives. But I couldn't stop myself from checking every room before leaving Emma anywhere. I installed cameras around our house, one in the living room, one in the bedroom, and one at the front door. I kept checking my phone during work, until my supervisor told me to use my personal phone. My mom came to help for a week, and when she saw how exhausted I was, she started crying. She offered to move closer to help, but she couldn't afford to rent here, and I couldn't help her relocate. We sat there, surrounded by bills and paperwork, and she kept saying that the system should have protected those children. I bought a lockable file cabinet at a garage sale and kept all the evidence in it, hospital records, video footage, police reports, everything. The detective working on our case called once to remind me that people like Miss Thompson often return to their old ways when they feel safe. She told me to keep all the evidence secure. Emma's 2nd birthday came around, and she was walking and saying a few words, which the doctor called good progress. We had a small party in the park, just me, my mom, and the kids. When Emma took her afternoon nap, I stood by her crib, counting her breaths as her chest rose and fell. I couldn't believe she was finally sleeping like any other child. For a few days, I couldn't think of anything at all. But then something would trigger my memory, and I'd be back in the hospital room. I started seeing a therapist through my company's employee assistance program, but I could only afford 6 sessions. He told me I had PTSD and would need long-term treatment, but my insurance didn't cover it. I learned to cope with the constant anxiety, going to work, paying bills, taking care of Emma. Some days were better than others. And I told myself it should be enough because Emma needed me, even if I wasn't perfect. Eventually, the $8,000 settlement came through, which didn't even cover a quarter of my legal expenses. But my lawyer said it was better than nothing. I signed the papers, knowing that we'd never get true justice or closure from any of this. The journey of uncovering the truth and seeking justice for our children had been long and painful, but I was finally moving forward. Thank you for letting me share this with you. If you've made it to the end, feel free to leave a comment. I love reading what you have to say.